Welcome to part 8 in this series of videos where we look at Blazor WebAssembly from a beginner's perspective. In this video, we consider what is needed to add functionality to allow the user to add, edit and delete cities. We'll start by having a quick look at the project so far and then have a preview of how I want the application to look after adding the ability to add, edit and delete cities. This is the countries and cities page as we've currently got it. We've got the ability to select a country, and if we select a country, it'll then display any cities in this grid. But unfortunately, there's no way to add, edit or delete cities, and that's what we're going to look at in this video. Let's have a look at how I propose the application should look after adding this functionality. After making the changes, this is how I intend the countries and cities form should look. We've now got a toolbar across here which allows us to add, edit and delete. And if we select a country, we should be able to click add and open up a dialog box. I also want to make this dialog box movable, and we can make it draggable by allowing the user to click on the header and then move it. But before we allow a user to add a city, we've got to make sure that they've got a country selected. So if they click add, we're going to warn the user, if they haven't got a country selected, that they need to choose one. Similarly, if we're going to allow a user to edit a country, we've got to make sure that they've selected a city. So again, we'll have a dialog pop up that'll warn them about that. And lastly, if the user wants to delete a city, again, we'll need to check that they've selected a city. But even when they've selected one, we want to make sure that they really do want to delete it. So that's how I intend the form to look once we've finished. You'll see here there's a couple of minor changes. I've got a horizontal bar in here and I'm not happy with the 3 decimal places in the population, so I'll make a change to that as well. In summary, we've got to make these changes. We're going to need to add a custom toolbar to the top of the grid. We're going to need to add a dialog control. We're going to check a country has been selected. And then when adding a city, we just need to add the code. When editing a city, we need to check the city has been selected and then add the code. And if we're deleting a city, we need to check a city has been selected and that the user wants to delete the specific city, and then we add the code. So those are the tasks. Let's get cracking and have a look at the code. We're going to be dealing with the countries and cities page, and that's actually the index.razor, which is found under pages under the client project. So we'll have a look at that. Now before we do too much to this, I want to just change the BR here to an HR, and that'll give us a horizontal row across the page between the drop-down list and the grid. The other change I'm going to make is the field we've got here is city name. In hindsight, I was a bit surprised that this worked, but it did. But regardless, I'm going to change this to what I think should be the correct format, which is this. I've had a revisit of some of the Syncfusion documentation, and I see it should be at name of and then the object dot field. So that we need to again replace city population with a revised version of that. Which is that. Right, so the first task is to add the toolbar. And we can do that by adding to the SF grid header here the following. So it just says toolbar, and then we're calling it toolbar items. It's got a red squiggly because we haven't defined it yet. To do that, we need to declare under here, let's put it under these, private list of type item model called toolbar items. So now we've got rid of the squigglies under toolbar items. But we also need to define the items on this in that list, and we can do that in the onInitialized async. And I'm going to put it, I think, at the top. So the list is going to consist of 3 items: add, edit, and delete. It's going to have tooltips, and we're going to have prefix icons. So that adds the toolbar items, but we need to add effectively the click event when the user clicks one of these toolbar items. And to do that, we need to add a grid events section after grid columns, and that's up here. So under here, we'll say grid events. On toolbar click, we want a toolbar click handler, and we're going to be passing to it the value of the city that the user clicks on. And the toolbar click handler is a method that we just need to add at the end of the code. So let's put it down here. And what that does is when a user clicks on a particular toolbar item, it looks at the arguments, and if the text is add, we're going to put the code in for adding here. If it's edit, we put the code in for editing here. And if it's delete, we'll put the code in for deleting here. If we swiftly run it, let's just check that we get the toolbar. And as we can see, we've got the toolbar, but nothing happens yet, and we haven't checked that the user has selected a country. But the next task is to add the dialog so that we can handle add, edit, and delete. Looking at our list of tasks, we've added the custom toolbar, and the next few tasks are to add a dialog control, check a country has been selected, and add a city. These are more intertwined than one thinks, so I'm going to change the order a little bit and check that a country has been selected, and then we'll move on to adding a dialog control and adding a city. To check that a country has been selected, we're going to be using the Syncfusion predefined dialog, and to do that we need to inject the Syncfusion dialog service at the top of the code. So let's do that. And get rid of that stray semicolon. And then at the top of the toolbar handler, we need to call that dialog service if no country has been selected. So at the top of the toolbar handler, at the very top, regardless of whatever the user does, we'll say if the selected country ID equals 0, display a dialog that says please select a country, no country is selected, and then return, so it doesn't go any further. The selected country ID is set when the onChange event happens for the drop-down, and we declared it further up as a parameter. So it's set to 0 by default. We can quickly test this before we go any further, so perhaps we ought to do that. Here it is. Now if I click add, edit or delete without selecting a country, it should give an error. Yes, or rather a message rather than an error. It says please select a country. If we do select a country and then click one of these, we don't get the error, the message. So that bit seems to be working. The next stage is to add a Syncfusion dialog, and this is quite a lot of code, so I'm just going to copy and paste it in. and it needs to be in the HTML section, or CS_HTML, so I'll put it underneath the grid. It doesn't matter where it appears actually, it could be above the grid. And this is the code. So we're declaring a Syncfusion dialog, and we're going to give it a name of dialog city. It's modal, so that means it'll pop up and the user will either have to enter data in this dialog box, they won't be able to click away from it. I'm giving it a width of 500 pixels. I'm not going to show the close icon because I want the user to either click save or cancel. Initially its visibility is set to false, and this time I'm allowing dragging, so allow dragging equals true. Then because I want it to be dragging, I need to have a header and a content section. And to do that, I have to declare a dialog template. And within the dialog template, we have a header section and a content section. The header is going to display some text, which is, at the moment is a variable, which I've called dialog title, and we'll declare that later. And the content, which is this section, consists of an edit form, and we're using a model yet to be defined called cities add edit, and on a valid submit it's going to call a method called cities save. It consists of a text box which is got a placeholder called city, which will always be displayed above the text box, and I'm binding it to this object, the cities add edit dot city name, and there's a numeric text box which is called population, and I'm binding it to citiesaddedit.citypopulation. I've got a width of 50 here. Then I've got a gap, 2 carriage returns effectively, and then a footer section which has got 2 buttons, a save button which is the on valid submit, and a cancel button which has this cancel method which we'll need to define. So that's the actual dialog. This dialog has got a number of variables, such as the city dialog, a dialog title, and things like that. And we're going to, not to mention the cities add edit, so we're going to declare a number of variables. So let me just add that down here, and I'm going to put it under the toolbar items. And these are the Syncfusion dialog called dialog city, the cities add edit object which is of type city, a string called dialog title which I'm going to default to add a country, and that will appear at the top in the header section of the dialog. Then within the dialog I'm going to have an integer for the city ID, a string for the city name, and an integer for the city population. And I'm either setting those to false, empty or 0. And within the toolbar handler, we now want to do something if we select add, and the code that we need for this is this. We're saying the dialog title is add a country, which it would default to anyway, but I'm setting it again here. We're creating a new cities add edit object, and we're opening the dialog. So the city dialog city is going to be shown. Once the dialog is open, the user will have the opportunity of entering a city name and a city population, and then we've got 2 options, the buttons for save and cancel. The cities save is a new method which I'll just show down at the bottom, or add to the bottom. It's a completely new method. And if the city ID is 0, it is a new city, and we've got to deal with the other option, which is the city ID is not 0, in which case we'll be editing a city. So if it's 0, we need to call we're setting the country ID to be the selected country ID from the drop-down list at the top. and then we're going to call the city insert service, and then we're going to hide the dialog. Then we're going to need to refresh the cities grid. We'll come back to the city insert in a minute, but I'm now going to add this new method called refresh cities, which we've basically got up here already. So when the country changes, we've got this code here, which is getting the cities. Now, instead of copying and pasting that and putting it down here, I'm choosing to have a separate method to deal with that. So let me put that in here. So as I say, this is simply the code that we had on the change of country, but instead of putting it again, repeating it in here, I'm creating a new method, and now I can use that new method up in the change event of the drop-down list. So I can get rid of that. And replace it with that line. We've also got to deal with the situation where the user may click the cancel button. And in that case, we don't really need to do very much other than to hide the dialog box. So I'll add a new method for that, which simply says dialog city hide. So we should find we've got rid of most of the red squigglies up at the top here. Which it looks as if we have done, but we're not out of the woods yet. We need to amend the city controller. When we created the city controller, we copied the country controller and used find and replace to substitute city for country, with variations for plurals and upper and lower case. However, the city object has more columns than the country, and we need to allow for this. So let me have a look at the country controller, which is under the server project controllers. And what we want to do is in the insert, we need to add some new parameters here, because we also want to add the city population and the country that the city is linked to. And we'll also need to change the SQL command. And it's now going to be this. So we're inserting into the city table the city name, the city population, and the country ID. And the values are going to be the parameters that we added up here. And we've got a similar situation when we update a city. So we need to add the additional parameters and then change the SQL. So the parameters are population and country ID, and we need to include those in the SQL command. All right, I'll save everything and test it. So if I try adding a city without selecting a country, I should get a warning message, which I do. And if I select a country, let's say France, and click add, I get a pop-up dialog. Modal, I can't click around it, I have to enter. And I can enter a population. And because it's draggable, I can click on the header, which says add a country, and move it around, and click save. And I now get Paris shown in the grid. If I click add and cancel, nothing happens, as one would hope. Okay, well, we can now move on to look at the edit. So back to the code. And for editing a city, the first thing we've got to make sure is that we've actually got a city row selected. So we need to add something to the grid events. And it's a row select handler. And so we now need to define the row select handler, which I'll simply add to the end of the code. So when a user clicks on a particular row, the city ID is going to be set to the city ID of the row. A variable called city name is going to be set to the city name from the record, and the city population is going to be set to the city population of the row selected. To check that a row has been selected, we can check that the city ID is not 0, and we'll reset these variables when we save a record. And again, we can use the Syncfusion predefined dialog to warn the user if no city has been selected. If a city ID is not 0, we can conclude that the user has selected a row and can then add a new empty cities add edit object and populate it with values established when the user clicked on the row. Then open the dialog to allow the user to make changes. And we can do that in the Toolbar select handler. So if the user selects edit, we can first of all set the dialog title to edit a country. So when the dialog pops up, it'll now say edit a country rather than add a country. If the city ID equals 0, i.e. nothing has been selected, we'll use the Syncfusion predefined dialog to say please select a city. Then we'll add a new cities add edit object, and we'll set the values of these various items to the various items that have been determined from the row select handler. And then we'll show the dialog. Once opened, the dialog will appear just as for adding, but will show the city name and city population of the record being edited. In the background, it'll keep the country ID and the city ID of that particular record. So when the user clicks Save on the dialog, we need to call the city update service in place of the city insert, and to pass to it the city ID of the city being updated together with the amended cities add edit object. So we need to change the cities save to allow this. And we add it here. We'll also need to await the cities refresh or the refresh cities grid, but we can actually move that outside and put it at the end because we want that to happen in all cases. Having updated the city record, we should clear the variables and reset the cities add edit object back to empty. We'll need to do this whenever we refresh the cities data grid. We can add the additional code to that method. So if we find the cities refresh grid, we can add the code here. And what I'm doing is whenever we refresh the cities grid, we're clearing the cities add edit object and resetting the values of the city ID, name and population. Time to save it and test it again. Again, if I try editing without selecting a country, I get a warning saying I've got to select a country. If I try editing without selecting a city, I'll get a warning saying no city selected. If I select a city and then click edit, I get, first of all, edit a country. I should say edit a city, shouldn't it? Edit a city, and we can then edit. So I can change its population to say 9 million rather. and then save. And I've got the same error here. That should say add a city. Right, I better change those when we get back to the code. So cancel, and we can now go back to the code. Our next our next task is deleting a city, but I'll just correct those titles first. So that was on the dialog. Should that say add a city? That should say edit a city. And when we declared it up here, right, that's corrected that. And now we can go to deleting a city. To delete a city, we must make sure that the user selected city, but we've got that covered. But we must also ask for confirmation that the user wants to delete the city. If both of the above are true, we then delete the city and refresh the city's data grid. So to do that, I'm going to change the code in the toolbar handler. So here we are, we've got the toolbar handler, and the code for deleting a city is this. First of all, we're checking that a city has been selected. So if city ID equals 0, we use the Syncfusion predefined dialog to say, please select a city, and then just return if they haven't. Otherwise, they will have a string called dialog message saying, are you sure you want to delete? And then we're selecting the city name. And then setting a Boolean called isConfirm to display the dialog service and ask for the user to select, are you sure you want to delete whatever the city is? And if that's true, we then await the city service city delete and then refresh the city's grid. In this case, there's no need to change anything to do with the city delete in the controller, because we don't need the city, other than the city ID, we don't need any of the other fields or columns. Right, let's save everything and, as usual, check it. So if I try deleting, it says I've got to select a country. If I select a country and then try deleting without selecting a city, I get the warning message. And if I select a city and then click delete, I'll get a message saying, delete city, are you sure you want to delete Paris? I'm going to say cancel, just to make sure that it doesn't delete it. And then if I select it again and delete and say OK, it deletes it and updates the grid. There's still a little bit of work to do on this page. For example, I want to make sure that we don't add two cities for the same country. In practice, of course, it's possible that the same city name can exist in two countries. So, for example, Birmingham exists in the UK and it also exists in the United States. And we'll need to put some code in to check that and to check on some other validation. But that's for the next video. Thank you very much for watching this one. I'll put a slide at the end with some useful links in, and the next video should be coming along shortly. Thank you very much for watching.